Welcome to this special episode of SHECP Talks, where we're excited to share a recording of a recent event featuring Christa Moore, co-author of Gendered Power in Child Welfare, What's Care Got to Do with It? Joined by Prusinski, Moore delves into the critical issues explored in the book, including the flaws within Kentucky's child welfare system and the gendered power dynamics that shape it. Listen in for a compelling conversation on how we can reimagine child welfare systems for more equitable and effective care.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Prusinski. I am an associate professor of education at Center College, where I also teach in the social justice program. And I am thrilled today to host this talk with Dr. Christa Moore, who's going to talk with us about her new book, Gendered Power in Child Welfare, What's Care Got to Do with It? Dr. Moore is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Virginia's College at Wise and a research affiliate for Western Kentucky University's Life Skills Center for Child Welfare Education and Research. She earned her Bachelor of Arts in Psychology and a Master of Arts in Sociology from Western Kentucky University, her PhD in Applied Sociology from the University of Louisville, and her Master's in Clinical Social Work from Simmons University in Boston. Dr. Moore's professional background spans over 20 years of direct practice in child welfare and human services in Kentucky, work that culminated in a recent book, Gendered Power in Child Welfare, What's Care Got to Do with It, co-authored with her colleague and mentor from the University of Louisville, Dr. Patricia Gagné. Her ongoing research focuses on child welfare cultures and comparative state-to-state outcomes, clinical sociology and social policy in child welfare, interagency collaboration among rural child welfare ecologies, community-based awareness, prevention, and advocacy, and bureaucratic cultures within gendered organizations. Dr. Moore is also a certified clinical sociologist and a practicing clinical social worker. And before I start with my first question, I just want to say congratulations on the book. It is a pretty astonishing piece of work. It's amazing to read something that's both so theoretically rich and also so grounded in the voices of the people who you interacted with to research it. So thank you for writing it. To start, I wondered if you could just give us an overview of the main ideas in the book and sort of how it came to be.
Sure. So, this book explores a few really important ideas within, the social world of child welfare and the systems of which it consists. Um, we're thinking about the legacy of history and cultural ideals, beliefs, and values about not only men and women, but families and children and communities. We're thinking about how child welfare services have become increasingly bureaucratized throughout, especially the modern era of child welfare. We're thinking about the idea that there's no one agency that can do all of the work that's required to assist families locally in rural areas or in urban or suburban areas. The work has just become too extensive and bureaucratized. And we're thinking about power and gender and how both of those social forces are embedded in many areas of social life. In fact, Michael Kimmel says that gender is central to all forms of social life, but what that actually looks like in practice, in our lives, in interactional and institutional ways.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
So, as you know, a lot of people who are involved in SHEP do work that straddles in some way the line between applied work and academic work. And one of the really remarkable, I think, aspects of your book is the way you integrate that applied work and academic work and insights from the applied world and the academic world. Could you tell us a little bit, sort of on a personal note, how your own journey from being an insider in those bureaucracies of human service organizations to being an academic researcher interact to inform your unique perspective?
Well, Yes, I can. And for me, what's so interesting about doing this talk um, within the SHEP community, focusing on poverty, is this work extends out of my own personal journey of poverty. Being a college student who was unable to only focus on college, I had to work pretty much full time to make sure I had access to everything I needed: food, housing, school supplies. And that wasn't just during my undergraduate career. I was working full time as a crisis intervention specialist when I was working on my master's degree. And then I was working for the state of Kentucky as a data analyst for the Division of Protection and Permanency, the Cabinet for Health and Family Services in Frankfurt, when I started my PhD work, my doctoral work. Um, I was working in this field too when I did both of my master's degrees. So for me, the distance between doing the academic work and the applied work in the field wasn't as far as I think people believe it can be or has to be to focus on one or the other. Now, it would have been an incredible gift to be able to be a full-time student and only focus on school, or to finish a degree and then only have to focus on the work itself. But for me, the junctures and intersections between working on these things concurrently actually added to and contributed to the ideas, the theories, the application of theory while I was doing my degree work and also working in the field. I came to see things that I took for granted as normal, as natural, as the way these systems just are designed to work, as really uh, more social constructions. They work this way because we've created them to work in this way. And if we've created them to work in this way, then people have the power to change these structures as well. And so it was like this light bulb that went off in my head when I was working on my dissertation in particular, which is where the book stems from, the work I did during my dissertation, the last 3 years of my PhD.
That's a beautiful formulation of how theory can help us see the world differently and help us imagine different futures. I think sometimes we forget about that part of theory, and I love that. So, speaking of theory, you argue that gendered power, and this is a quote from your book, quote, gendered power is a factor in the rising rates of substantiated and repeat cases of child maltreatment, as well as the increasingly challenging experiences of stress, overload, and burnout experienced by professional care workers. Could you tell us a little bit about how this works? How does gendered power play out in this system to create these extra this extra stress and these extra problems experienced by both workers and families?
Sure. Well, one of the foundational ideas in child welfare is that people who do the work really care about the work they're doing. They don't come into the field. Practitioners don't come into the field knowing that they're going to make a lot of money, or most of us are not going to get famous or be, accredited or recognized, right, for the very hard work that we do on a daily basis. We do it because we have a heart for struggle. We have a heart for care, um, just like, many educators and many other people who go into care fields. They have a heart for others in their community. We don't want to see people suffer. None of us want to see people in pain, especially children and other vulnerable people who are disempowered in some way and cannot access their own voice or be heard when they do. And so the gender within this argument really is tied to this idea that vulnerable people in a society are gendered in many ways, just in the way that gender can equal disempowerment, subordination, a lack of voice or power. But gender works at multiple levels within the conversation I'm making and within everyday life. So we can think about this personally, interpersonally. We can think about interactions. We can think about institutions. I don't want to get too deep or too broad because I know we have a limited amount of time. But let's maybe connect with the idea that human services came out of a very gendered history of care. Women in their communities who, because they could not work as professionals just yet, were doing what they could as volunteers. They were caring for the most vulnerable in their communities. Then they'd go home, they'd talk about it with their brothers, their fathers, their husbands, other men in their lives who could work, who did have power, who did have an education. Eventually, women enter the workforce and bring with them that inclination for caring, nurturing. And this is some of where we get very gendered occupations, like work that's called women's work, social work, mental health, nursing, teaching. Those are all viewed as very gendered occupations. But when we professionalize those occupations, we turn them into a professional job that's time limited and has other constraints. So although we continue to care, right? When we do this work as a job, we are told, maybe not directly, but indirectly, okay, you're getting paid to care from 8 to 5. And then you get to go home and you don't have to worry about it anymore until you come back to work at 8 or 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. But that's just not how care works. You cannot bureaucratize the heart. And so that's one of the key arguments in the book is that even though organizations make it possible for us to do child welfare and other forms of care work quite broadly and sometimes quite effectively and quite efficiently in reporting and documenting and constraining our time within, right, that very limited time frame of the work itself, we are also losing focus on the most essential and most important relational aspects of care work.
That's great. There's a lot of parallels there with teaching. I teach in education, and we talk a lot about care and the ways care is both expected and rewarded, but difficult to sustain in systems that sort of actively deprofessionalize teachers. And so we read Nell Noddings, who you also cite in your book, who distinguishes between care about a job and care about a person, and how, being an effective educator, for example, requires some balance of those two. So thank you for that explanation. That's really helpful. Could you, sort of in the same vein, in a way, you make this really interesting to me distinction in the book between an ethics of care and an ethics of justice.
Yeah.
And this is a fairly nuanced argument in your book, I'd say, that moving more towards an ethics of care, not abandoning an ethics of justice, but integrating an ethics of care, perhaps moving more on the spectrum towards care and away from justice, could help improve the lives of vulnerable children and their families. Could you talk about that shift from an ethics of care, I'm sorry, an ethics of justice to an ethics of care?
Yeah, those concepts and principles come out of a large literature on gender and how it works in our relationships and our sense of self and identity, how it is embodied in our professional work and in the occupations that we choose. In the work that Patricia Gagné and I did for this book we relied heavily upon not only Nell Noddings, but also Carol Gilligan and her work on ethics of care and ethics of justice. And so when we apply that to child welfare, what we're really thinking about is how in modern child welfare systems that are heavily organized in bureaucratic ways, they are steeped in an ethic of justice, meaning, right, that there is some form of standardization and fairness that is prioritized and held up as a focus for the work, right? The services to families should be equitable, and policies and practices are in place to keep a very incredibly large workforce committed to doing things in very similar ways for very similar reasons that are tied to just services, to fairness, to having at a minimum, standard of care that's tied to best practices as often as possible. So, this is where we get ideas like liability and accountability and um, even collaboration, making sure that if we collaborate for one family, we try our best to collaborate for all families, right? And so those ideas are really housed under the umbrella of um, an equitable distribution of service, effort, and time and energy, liability, and accountability. However, in human services, and in particular, child welfare and child maltreatment, we're working with individuals and families who, although they may be similar in many common ways, if we're thinking about trends and patterns, right? Everyone is unique, and the problems they have uniquely impact them. The relationships they have with each other are unique, relational, they're special. The problems that they have are equally unique. The communities they live in, right? The way that they resolve conflict and strife or fail to. These are very individualized circumstances. Um, and the crisis that we're working with as interventionists may not, we may not be able to resolve it in a day, in an 8-hour workday. It may not fit within even a 40-hour work week, right? And so, how do we best help families? Is it through standardization or through understanding that we really need those caring relationships so that families trust us?
Mm.
And we can also trust them to follow through on something they've been asked to do by the courts or by child protective services or by a therapist or a doctor who makes an informed recommendation, right? How how can we really make and sustain change in this relational way? And when we think about it from that framework, we're thinking about the power and the essential nature of an ethic of care.
That's a really useful sort of overview of how complex the system is and how changes that are meant to accomplish one thing sometimes have unintended consequences and shift the whole balance within a system. Thank you. So to build on that last point, could you tell us a little bit about um, what do you tell someone, a student in particular, who's interested in entering this field, who really wants to make change, who really wants to be involved in, that ethic of care that you describe?
Yeah. Well, I tell them in my classes and in one-on-one conversations that the work is important, essential, protecting families and especially children. It's my personal and professional belief that we all share in that. societal obligation and responsibility. It actually does take a village to not only raise children, but to help keep each other safe and healthy and to support each other so that we all can thrive however possible and whenever possible. I tell students that this is really rewarding work, but that it's also really challenging work. It challenges us to, as professionals, whether we're thinking about being a teacher or an interventionist within the child protection world, whatever that may look like from whatever discipline, it challenges us to put ourselves in really difficult positions as observers, as partners, as supporters, as advocates, as maybe even social justice warriors, whatever your ethos is, your philosophy may be, it's hard work because we know we are going into a field where we're going to witness suffering. And the goal is to help, the goal is to make a difference. And many more times than not, we can make a difference. But we also have to accept that these are um, people with dynamic lives. People don't stand still. Life unfolds in unpredictable ways. And the best predictor of crisis for a family, especially where child maltreatment is a concern, is having one report
Mm.
and then one substantiated incident of child abuse and neglect. That is the best predictor for future interpersonal violence. And so, understanding the research, understanding what you're learning about the field, understanding the importance of practicing and honing your skill set,
Mm.
especially the ability to communicate, to connect, to talk, the social dimensions of the work, to build trust, to build rapport, to be able to follow through on what you say you can and will do. And that's where all the bureaucratic pieces of the work can both empower the work, but also constrain it because it's emotional labor. It's exhausting work. And as much as we want to do everything that's required of us, everything we say we're going to do, everything we know we need to do, there's only so many hours in our workday. There's only so many hours in the day itself. And it can be exhausting just as much as it can be empowering work
Mhm.
to do.
Um, I have one more question, and then I see we have some audience questions. So maybe if I could ask you this last one, and then we can turn to the chat and see what's come up there, if that sounds okay for you.
Sounds
Okay.
great.
So your research took place in Kentucky, obviously, but you note that you could find a lot of these issues in the child welfare system across the country. So could you tell us a little bit about your plans for expanding this work to other states?
Yeah, so in fall of 2024, I connected with and took the beginning early steps to collaborate with Western Kentucky University's Life Skills Center for Child Welfare Education and Research as a study partner on a nationwide study called Cultures of Child Protection. And so, what we are looking for and what we are looking at are the experiences of practitioners throughout the continental United States and perhaps territories. Um, we'll have to see where the research takes us. But we're very interested in learning, how similar are practitioner experiences to what I learned from speaking to people in Kentucky who were not only in child protective services, they were in the court system, they were in domestic violence programs, they were in homeless shelters. These were professionals who were working as doctors and nurses and in mental health and all of the agencies in a community where families might turn to for support. And so, and who are collaborating extensively to serve the needs of a shared pool client families. So we're focusing on child protection and the practitioners who work within those systems, services, agencies, and programs nationwide. And Jen will have a flyer available on the SHEP website later, and that has some recruitment opportunities. But I'm really excited about this work and its scope. This is going to take us at least 3 years, but we are off to a really good start because this is work people care about. This is work people want to talk about. And these are policies and practices that we want to enhance and modify and change in positive and substantive ways. Um, and we want to include families as well. So at some point, we will also be reaching out to families who've been served by these systems, just as I did in the research I did in Kentucky, to hear their voice as well and their standpoint, right? Experiences, because that's essential to know and understand.
Sounds like 3 years is ambitious. It sounds like it could be a lifelong project. Honestly, it sounds really exciting to be part of. I hope everything goes well with it.
Mhm.
So the first question actually kind of dovetails on the points you just brought up about practitioners. So the first question is, do you feel like your time as a practitioner, especially your experience with field work, has impacted how you interact with practitioners in your role as an academic researcher? So, for example, does it make it easier for you to gain trust in these communities or improve the quality of the information you're getting from practitioners?
So I think there's two ways that being a practitioner have really helped me. There's more ways than two, but two immediately come to mind. First of all, um, it helps me to connect in a really meaningful way with other practitioners because I've worked in crisis intervention, I've done parent education, I was a family preservation specialist, and who also worked in family reunification and supervision for children who were in foster care and custodial mediation. And then I got to work for the state of Kentucky, which also had a federal element. So I got to work with, statewide and regional and local data within Kentucky and start to understand the patterns and trends that we were seeing to help identify some of the more problematic areas, not just of family life, but of the state itself and
Mm.
how we could, right, enhance and target those areas for pilots and programs. The other way that being a previous practitioner helped was through understanding the nuance of what was being shared, the nuances. Burnout means many things to different people, right? And the way that it looks, the way that it expresses itself emotionally, physically, occupationally, interactionally, it's an individualized experience. Are there things that people have in common? Yes. But the way I feel something is uniquely how I know it and how I feel it, right? And so, but because I have that experience, somebody else says, I got burned out and I had to do something different, or I had to go on antidepressants for a year because I just couldn't cope. I understand the depth of that and the reasons why someone would feel the need to do those things or not. And so, being a previous practitioner really helped me to connect and to understand where others were coming from.
I will say, as a reader, that depth of understanding and that nuance really comes through in the book. I think it's something that sets this book apart. And I think a lot of students in particular will learn a lot from because it is not a perspective that maybe many of them have encountered from multiple angles before. So that is a really extraordinary accomplishment, I think.
Thank you.
The
It was
second
my hope. That was my hope.
The second question is, were you able to identify a possible starting point for moving to an ethic of care within the larger bureaucratic system? In other words, where do you start?
Yeah. So everyone who goes into this field gets training. In fact, this is another claim we make in a book that, how can we come to understand that rates of child maltreatment are continuing to increase nationwide, but practitioners are the best trained they've ever been
Mm,
in the entire history of the child welfare
mm,
system. How do we explain that when we have
mm.
better tools than we've ever had before? And so I lost track of your question. Can you repeat it?
Sure, yeah. The question is about how we accomplish this move from an ethic of justice to an ethic of care. Where do we start? And actually, the next question is sort of similar. If you want me to add that in now or try to integrate it, um, the next question mentions that something the speaker found really inspiring about the book was these concrete ideas you incorporate for how the system can change to support families. So you don't leave us in a hopeless place. Actually, you give us some ideas. So can you give us some examples about what those suggestions might look like in practice, and what students can do to be part of the structural solutions beyond perhaps what they're already doing on the day to day on the ground?
Yeah, so part of it is about education, right? Understanding that we can have every tool imaginable, but these tools aren't going to be effective, in my experience, in my opinion, if we don't have a relationship with the family,
Mm,
with the clients, the patients, the students, the consumers, whatever we want to call the families and children who are being served within the child welfare system. The relationship is essential for enduring change. And so, helping students to understand, and not only students, but in our ongoing professional development, even those of us who have been in the field for 10, 20, 30 years or longer, these ideas, they need to resurface time and time again, right? That it's not just this outcome of serving a certain number of families or increasing this rate of substantiated child maltreatment, right? We can focus on those outcomes and be outcome driven, but the performance factor is really tied to the dimension of trust
mm,
and the relationship, those relational dimensions that are really driven by the care that we embody and exert as child welfare practitioners, as human service interventionists. And so in the book, Pat and I argue and suggest and recommend that these aspects of these relational dimensions be more heavily emphasized as
mm,
part of the training and
mhm,
continuing education, but that at an organizational level, existing services and programs and organizations can take a look at how much they talk about it, how much they put it into policy and practice, that we want to work to build relationships, not only with families, but with fellow practitioners. Collaboration is also essential because no one agency can do this work, especially for those who are most profoundly impacted by not only violence, interpersonal violence, including child maltreatment, but all of the other social factors that influence and are tied to vulnerability and precarity,
mm,
right? Whether that be homelessness or job loss and unemployment or food insecurity or substance abuse or, a natural disaster,
mm,
which has really impacted the most vulnerable where I'm living right now in Southwest Virginia and, Eastern Tennessee, Western North Carolina, Eastern Kentucky. So, but it's relationships that are the most empowering and that help us be the most resilient
Mm.
as we work to make these changes and continue to do the work itself.
Great, thank you. So the next question is again sort of directly tied to this theme of burnout and care. And this question starts, I appreciate you mentioning emotional labor because this was reminding me of Arlie Hochschild's work. Um, how do you balance bringing care into social services while avoiding burnout, which does happen frequently in this field?
Yeah. For a very long time within the history of child welfare and other systems as well, these were seen as jobs where we had to sacrifice our own well-being, our own care. People sort of internalize this philosophy of sacrifice. I have to give up something to give care to someone else. But the frameworks and the philosophies are changing and have changed. Now there is a really steady and consistent emphasis on things like self-care.
Mm.
And that is just as essential a form of care as any other form of care that we embody in our work and exert. And so there's lots of conversations as part of training, as parts of, collegial support. We need to take time. We need to take a step back. We need to support each other. We need to make space and hold time to care for ourselves, especially if we've experienced secondary or vicarious trauma, especially if we've had a difficult case like a near fatality or a child fatality, especially if the family we've been working with for a year has had their kids removed and they may or may not return. So these are really difficult and challenging scenarios. And we are in a support role where we choose to occupationally support others. But in order to do that, we also have to prioritize taking care of ourselves.
That to me is an interesting example also of how your rich experience in the field helps inform your perspective, that you have that view of the field that encompasses enough time to be able to point to changes in the discourse and the ways changes in the discourse might help empower practitioners to stay in the field and avoid burnout or manage burnout, perhaps is a better way of saying it. So the last question in the chat, and then we'll maybe give one last opportunity for anybody to add anything if they want to. Now would be a great time. But the last question we have in the chat right now is, are there positive examples you've seen in the world for effectively empowering people and communities with more agency, or reduce stigma, or increase access and trust in the resources in their area? So for context, an example I'm seeing in the world is the Confess Project that trains barbers in mental health advocacy to reduce stigma around mental health and help people consider care and help people get access to support. Um, have you seen other examples of things that are really working out there in the world?
Yeah, so in Virginia and in many other states as well, there is a growing movement to include previous clients or even sometimes existing clients in the work itself
Mm.
and to capitalize upon their lived experiences of going through systems such as the child welfare system to help turn their successes into supportive roles within the system itself. So, Virginia is growing a lived experience initiative. One other example of this type of movement are the peer recovery specialist certifications that folks who have gone through substance abuse and recovery efforts, which also intersects with child maltreatment and child welfare systems, um, empowering people who have gone through these experiences and further educating them to learn how to activate that knowledge, that experience, um, that very nuanced sort of live standpoint to help others who are going through it now figure out how to negotiate really complex systems and demands, system demands, so that they can have an equally successful outcome along the way down the road. So, parents as partners,
Mm.
customers as partners is a growing movement that
Mhm.
I think has the power to really positively impact child welfare systems, the substance abuse and recovery worlds, and many other systems, um, that are embedded within what we call human services and care work.
Those are great concrete examples. Thank you. Where I live in central Kentucky, I see some of those, and you gave me a new way of looking at them, which I really appreciate. Thank you. So our last question that trickled into the chat is, you've talked about the importance of relationships and collaboration, but of course, building relationships takes time. So, how do we do this? Do we need to explore how to decrease caseloads or increase staffing, or is it really just about changing how we approach the work?
Yeah, I'm so glad that that question came up because time is something that Pat and I really emphasized in the book. Time is such a limited resource, but it's an essential resource, right? It makes everything happen. We have to build relationships with the families we're serving, as well as with our colleagues and partners within our own agencies and across agencies. But time can be a real barrier, especially if we're working, in a 6 to 8 to 10 to 12-hour day, whatever it may be, for those who are on the clock. And so, what Pat and I emphasize is the idea of using all the many varied forms of technology that we have available to us now. When I first came into the field, we all didn't even have computers to use. Getting a laptop was a really remarkable thing when I was about 5 or 6 years into my career. Um, Going from pagers to flip phones to Blackberries to smartphones, those were tremendous improvements in our ability to use technology to not only collaborate more effectively, but to also save time. And so we can dictate our notes now and not necessarily have to sit down and type them. And, some of our dictation systems even have transcription software built into them, like using Zoom, where we can just download, review, correct any errors, and then stick that right into the client file. We now have apps for many documentation and time management and reporting systems where we can do it wherever we are. So for example, when I used to pull over on the side of the road after leaving a home visit and take notes so I could remember what happened to type it up later or to write it up later in my progress note, now we can just very quickly click off a checklist in an app or enter an amount of time, or whatever the requirements may be. And so, a lot of larger for-profit systems have the money and the resources to invest in those types of technologies. More rural or nonprofits, volunteer agencies may not have as much, but those technologies, because they are unfolding so rapidly, the cost associated with them is also like getting better. So I'm hoping as we see our technology improve, it will also give us an edge
Mm.
with the time that it takes to focus on other things. And in my opinion and in my experience, the most effective outcomes were precipitated by uh, building relationships of trust. And then you can do so much more in so much less time when you take the time to build that relationship on the front end.
That also reminds me very much of Noddings and her insights into the challenges that teachers face in building trust with students in an increasingly standardized and bureaucratized school system that uses standardized testing as a proxy for understanding learning and understanding individualized students. But she also sort of has this hopeful note about how teachers can do that. So there's one last comment, and I wonder if the commenter would like to unmute and mention it themselves and speak for themselves. I'm happy to read it, but it's really eloquent and beautiful, and I don't want to take your voice from you.
Oh, okay. Well, the book was so eloquent and so beautiful, so it's really a thrill to have this opportunity to hear you talk about it. And so, when I read it, I'm a sociologist, and so of course I've read a lot of sociological studies. This was really top three for me in terms of how masterfully written, as Ellen pointed out, like the way it weaves theory and methods and storytelling. It was just so readable, something that sociologists have an especially hard time doing sometimes. I really thought like this reminds me of Evicted. Just thought it was really that quality of writing and research. And so anyway, I wanted to just thank you for such a really just remarkable book and all of your work. And then I was wondering about the public response to the book. The impact or reception that it's had, and then given the difficulty that we can have having academic work really reach the public. I'm just wondering what your thoughts were on how this kind of message and this book can or is reaching more of the public, because it's just so, I mean, this is public sociology through and through, and I know that can just be really hard to get it widely dispersed. So how can this become the next Evicted? I guess is part of what I'm wondering.
I would love that. I would love for it to go bigger and wider. And I think, progressively it's, maybe heading in that direction, which speaks to, I think, how much people in communities care about this type of work, care about our children and our families and protecting them. We're not just thinking about the institution of the family, we're thinking about people we know, people who we grew up with, people who we encounter in both professional life and right in the populations that we serve, because interpersonal violence, has no boundaries. It's everywhere and affects all of us in one way or another, whether we realize it or not. And so some of the public response has been invitations to speak, not just book talks in person or like this one, but I'll be speaking at the Virginia Crimes Against Children conference this fall. And I'll be going to some of the NAMI events and some NASW events, National Association of Social Workers, and National Association for Mental Illness, NAMI. So, the work is out there. People from all across the state of Virginia, Kentucky, even some folks from Tennessee, and some other parts of the country have reached out to me with interest. I've gotten some requests for training and consultation from some organizations who are looking at their policies and practices and wanting to have conversations about how to make space and hold space for additional time, frameworks for building relationships during difficult times, like multi-crisis or multi-problem oriented families, where the crisis is at this really high level and people see that as a barrier, but actually that's an opportunity. And so having these conversations both professionally, collegially, and then publicly, I think is one of the greatest, the best, the most consistent opportunities for getting the word out there. Just having these conversations opens up the platform for consideration and change. And Andrea, I want to thank you so much for the very wonderfully detailed review. I just am really heartened to know that this book is making sense. We were worried about being so theoretically driven and how much it would be accessible to not only other scholars, but to the general public and to students too.
Yeah, well, awesome. Well, thank you so much again for this book. I will be using it in my intro sociology to show how you weave theory and how you talk about your methods and do methods, and then, of course, the important message that you have. So thank you again.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
So Christa, thank you again so much for doing this. To close, could we go back to this idea about widening the scope? If we have practitioners on the call or practitioners who are listening or folks on the call who maybe are connected with practitioners who would like to be involved, could you just tell us briefly how they might contact you and how they could have their voices included in your project?
Yes, and so the project that is still in the process of launching, it's still early days. It's called Cultures of Child Protection, Exploring Child Welfare Systems Nationwide. And so we are looking for practitioners who have 1 year or more of direct service experience with families who are vulnerable, who are at risk of one or more forms of child abuse, neglect, or maltreatment. That does not only have to be Child Protective Services investigators, it can be anyone who collaborates with those practitioners or who serves those families and children within their discipline, their program, their services. And so we are hoping to schedule in-depth interviews with people who want to talk and have a discussion one-on-one with me or another member of the research team from WKU. You can contact me directly. I have my contact information on the flyer that Jen is going to post. If you want to write it down now, it's cjm4vx@uvawise.edu. My phone number is also available. You can call me anytime or email me. You can text me too. If you would prefer not to talk, but still you're interested in providing your point of view, some description of your past experiences or current, we also have those interview questions set up as an anonymous questionnaire. The Qualtrics link is also on the survey. It's just a QR code that gives folks who want to do the questionnaire an opportunity to go into the questionnaire survey in survey form and complete it. If you do that and you find you still want to talk, I mean, you can still contact me and we'll talk more. We are going to be doing focus groups at the Title IV Roundtable at the University of Alabama in May 20th through the 22nd. So if there's providers who will be attending that conference, we would love to talk to you there, either individually, one-on-one, or as part of the focus group. And then I have some graduate students who are working on a content analysis piece of the study and a secondary analysis piece of the study. We want to understand the nuances of how each state's own process of collecting and analyzing their child protection data compares to the nationwide report that gets aggregated across all states. Because in my interviews with people, informal interviews with practitioners from across different states, there seems to be some very concerning differences between those data analyses processes. And so we want to understand how that works.
Great. Thank you so much again, and thank you all. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. As Jen notes, we're going to be releasing the event as a SHEP Talk podcast. So that information that Christa just mentioned, as well as some additional notes, will be available on the SHEP website soon. So thank you all so much. Have a great afternoon wherever you are.